Go!
Hello everyone, welcome to Practical GCP. So today's topic is about having a new way to stream data directly from PubSub into BigQuery. So this is a new type of subscription that the PubSub message queue provides that allows you to get data directly streamed into BigQuery without anything in the middle. So what do I actually mean by that? So in the past, if you need to stream data, especially at volume, from the PubSub message queue into BigQuery, you first need to create a topic, and then you need to create a subscription, which could be either push subscriptions that you push via some kind of, like, say, Cloud Run or Cloud Functions, then, or you have this kind of pull subscription, which you have Cloud Data Flow typically sits in the middle to get those messages. So Cloud Data Flow has always been kind of the most used component to get data from a PubSub subscription into BigQuery. But what Google has recently introduced is to have this direct way, right? As kind of, you can see this as a shortcut to get data from a subscription, which is a new type of subscription called the BigQuery subscription. And you can get data directly streamed from here into there without needing something in the middle. So in today's session, I'll walk through the functionality of how this stuff works, and show you what I've done to try it out, and also talk about what you probably want to use it for, and what you probably don't want to use it for, with the limitations attached to this new feature. So let's crack on. So this is the page that talks about this new type of subscription for PubSub. So it's quite a useful page, and it's quite important. So let me quickly run through this to give you some context, so you see kind of where to find this thing and then try it out, right? So this, as I mentioned, is a direct way to get data from the PubSub message queue into BigQuery. There's a number of benefits, but I think the most important one is probably the offer the low cost option, because if you deploy a data flow job, right, or using a data flow template, those things always has to be deployed, right? You need to manage the workers, the auto scaling, the machines that you sell, right? So it's something that you need to manage one way or the other. So, but by deploying the streaming job as a subscription, the whole thing is abstracted away from you, right? So you don't need to worry about that. All you have to do is to create a subscription, and the data will be going to the BigQuery itself. The way this works is, if you look at this section, one of the most important thing is when you use this feature, you have the choice to say if you want to use the schema or not. The schema, so when you're actually creating a PubSub topic where you can send the messages to, right, you have the option, right, keep in mind it's optional, it's not mandatory, to attach a schema to the topic using either the Avro format or the protobuf format. So if you specify a schema, then you have the option to use it, right? If you don't use it, what you get is this thing, right? When the data goes into BigQuery, you need to have the table created with a column called data, which can be a type of bytes or string. And then it will write the whole message payload from your PubSub topic into that single column, right, in BigQuery. There's also a bunch of metadata you can enable to write. This is quite useful. In my opinion, I would always try to write as much as I can, right? So this would include things like the subscription name, message ID, publish time. This, again, is if you don't use a schema, and then obviously you have the attribute of the payload. The last option is obviously your choice if you want to drop anything that is not known, right? So if you send, let's say you send a column that is not known by the schema, and do you want it to stuck, right? So if you don't spy this option, the subscription will end up in an error state, and then the message will remain in the subscription backlog. So it depends on how you want to kind of set this, and then how strict you want this to be. Okay, let's now talk a quick quickly talk about the schema compatibility thing. So this is probably the most important part you need to pay attention to, because this is also later on I'm going to talk about the limitation of what you can use this thing for and what you probably don't want to use this thing for. And the way this works is you can see you have the Avro to Zeta SQL. So Avro is, so the PubSub has two ways that you can represent the schema. You can either use Avro or can use protobuf, right? So the BigQuery schema is described using the Zeta SQL standard. So when you define the schema, you can see there's a mapping table here, right? So the mapping table is telling you what the schema, the column type, right? Or the data type on the left, which is Avro in this case, is going to be compatibly mapped into the Zeta SQL type on the right, which is the BigQuery side. Actually quite interesting is also supporting the record type, which works really nicely because this is a native Avro type and also is a native BigQuery type. And this can be very useful in a lot of the scenarios. But one thing you probably noticed is a note here that it said it does not support Avro logical type. If you quickly glance through the list, you probably notice that there isn't a type that understands something like a timestamp, right, or a date time column, which is a very commonly used type in BigQuery. So I'll come back to that when I showed you what I've actually done, because I actually encountered this issue, and then there are probably some number of workarounds to get around that, but it's not kind of ideal to not have this kind of support. So now I'm going to walk through what I've actually done. What I'm using here is a BigQuery public data set, which is the Google Trends of top terms. So this table has the DMA name, the DMA ID, and then the term, week, score, rank, and refresh date. You can see it's got string, integer, date, right, and the three data types. And you can see that date isn't supported. And in the preview, you can see this is what the data looks like, right? This is not, it's very simple in terms of what we can use in here. So what I've done is, and obviously later I'll share the source code, you can see, you can try this yourself, is I've actually fetched the most recent dates of the data from this top terms in the Google public data set, and then send it into the PubSub topic. Right, this is something I've just basically, making the event streams. The reason I do this is because this has a fixed schema. So what I've done is after I produced the messages to the topic, I can create a schema to replicate this. And then what I've done on the other side, if I've actually created two schemas in the direct PubSub to BQ dataset. One is with the topic schema, and the other one is without. So if you look at the one with, very straightforward, you can see it has all of these ones, right? But plus the metadata columns I mentioned earlier. And then the ones that without, right? So you just have the data column, which in this case is a string I put in there. And then you have the metadata columns in here as well, right? Pay attention to what I've done in here. So the refresh date in the source schema, right, is a date. But I had to convert it to a string in here because date is not a supported type because it's a Avro logical type, right? And then that's the limitation I was referring to earlier. If you don't know what Avro logical type is, I'm just going to quickly, give you this page and then walk through it. So you in Avro, it can support the number of logical types. For example, here you've got decimal, UID, and date, right? And you've got time, milliseconds, microseconds, and many of these other ones. You could also have custom logical types, which expand this to a different kind of spectrum. But the point being here is it does not support this. So you can't use things like a date, right, in this particular case. And then, so that's one of the limitations you have to live with, and to convert it to something that you can use instead. So what I've done here is I've deployed this topic, which is the kind of mirroring the public data set with a schema of this. So you can see when you've created it, you can use in this case, I've used the Avro schema definition. You can see that you've got a record in here, and then you have all of the columns. I've converted, you can see these two strings, right? Because it doesn't support date. I can't use date. And then that is the schema I've attached to this topic. Then I've created the two subscriptions, which is matching to those tables. This is where it gets interesting, right? So when you create the subscription, you can see if you create a new one, in here you can see there's a new option to write into BigQuery, and this gives you the option of the project, the data type, data set, and the table, right? And then the three options are the three options I've described earlier in that documentation. So you can use the topic schema. If you don't use it, it will go into the data column. If you use it, it will check at the time of creation of your subscription to make sure the schema from the topic and then your subscription match up, right, with the BigQuery table. Then you can decide if you want to write metadata or if you want to drop the unknown columns, right? That's the rest of the configuration on the subscription is exactly the same as before. So you've got the topic with the schema attached, two subscriptions in there. So now this is all you need. You can create this with gcloud or Terraform, and then there isn't any additional things for you to set up. And once this is set up, you have basically the streaming going on from the PubSub directly into BigQuery. So I've got this working already. So you can see in the node topic schema, if you preview the data, this is what it looks like, right? Is to chuck the whole thing into the data column, right? And these are the additional attributes, the columns in the metadata that is sent to you, which is very useful, especially the message ID and then published timestamp. Those things are usually very useful for debugging and actually checking, where is the latency, what happened, and things like that, right? So you've got everything chucked into here. You can see these are converted into strings because when I fetch the data, I had to deliberately convert it to a string. If it's a date, it's not going to work, right? On the other side, where you can see I've got all of the columns in here, but again, the refresh date is converted to a string. In the preview, you can see now, this is because it understands the schema attached to the topic. So you have the exact columns, then matching and streamed into the right columns, the right data types into BigQuery, right? But these ones, obviously you can't use them as dates. You have to convert them when doing comparisons because it's a string here, it's not a date. If you have any other things like timestamps, you have to convert it yourself before you can use it. So that's pretty much what I've done. So I have uploaded this whole thing I've done with the gcloud command to create all of the schemas, the topic, subscription, the two subscriptions you've got in there, and also the code in the main .py for you to be able to check, to try out this whole thing. So I basically get the data into here, with those fields, templated the query, and then you can use Ginger to run it, to pass the rendered query, and then send the whole thing into the PubSub topic, right? So this is working, and you can use this to try out this feature, just to see what it works like, end to end. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the limitations now here again. So, right, as you can see, it doesn't support any of the date types, right? Whether that's Avro or protobuf, right? It just doesn't support any of that. So obviously you can. There's a number of options. I think for the the date or the timestamp side of things, you can, for the date, you can convert it to a string, which can be easily kind of converted back. But for the timestamps, what you probably want to do is to convert it into a Unix timestamp, right? That's an integer that you can store it in the int area. If you wanted more positions, you can store it in the long area. But at the end of the day, it's the same mapped all to the BigQuery integer on the other side, but you do have the option, when you produce the message, you can convert it to a compatible type, and then it will go into BigQuery as expected. But it's a little bit annoying because one thing I would hope for, but obviously it's doing a very strict mapping between the two data types, right? But one thing I was hoping for is, if you have an ISO date, if you think about how most of the the BQ load drops, right, or from the data flow, if you have an ISO date, right? That can be directly loaded into the timestamp or data type in BigQuery. But here, obviously, with the Averroll type, you don't really have that option. It's just a little bit annoying in there that you have to do your conversion before you can use this feature. There is another limitation I think here is I think a lot of you rather than having like one topic for one kind of schema and one kind of thing, very often what you would end up doing is you would have a topic, right? Doesn't necessarily have a schema, and you have a mixture of different kind of messages in there. And when you have that kind of situation, it's actually quite common, whether on PubSub or Kafka. Many people typically have one topic, and then for many different kind of purposes, right? Because especially the topic has the way that you can create a subscription with a filter to filter the type of messages you're interested in. And if you have that kind of situation, you can't use this with the schemas, because it will all go into this data column, right? It will all go into this data column because you don't have a fixed schema in your topic. And that's going to be a problem, because you can't just map it to something specific like this, right? That is not going to work because the schema is dynamic. So it's a semi-structured data, which is, PubSub is mostly designed for anyways. It typically doesn't really have a very, fixed schema for all of the things that you send. It will be subjective to the context of the message, right? So this is the thing, if you have, hundreds of messages that come into one topic, which can be common in some of the use cases, then, I don't think sending it to this data column for all of that stuff is a good idea. Especially think about it. If these messages, you may have, sensitive information, right? So if you have that, you chuck it to a string column, that's going to make tagging incredibly difficult, because BigQuery support policy tags. If you check them all in one column, you can't really utilize the feature of of DLP to detect data anymore, because it's a mixture of everything in there. So then the traditional way of using Cloud Data Flow to split the message from the single PubSub topic into multiple streams and then track them into different BigQuery tables, in that sense, in my opinion, it would be a lot better in design rather than just use this. But this is still incredibly useful. I guess the things you can use it for, I can think of two use cases. One is the dead letter queue. So typically, when some messages cannot be produced, right? In the past, when you send it to a dead letter queue, you still have to somehow usually get it into BigQuery, right? But if you use this feature to get the messages from the dead letter queue directly into BigQuery, then you don't have to deploy a data flow template to do that. It would just be direct streaming. And then because the dead letter queue is because the message is broken anyways, so you don't really care, right? To map it to a specific schema. You would just chuck into the data column and you can see everything inside it for debugging purposes, right? The other thing is, I guess when you have semi-structured data and when you have something you don't really care too much about the schema, then you can use the thing that just doesn't have a schema in the topic, and then again put it into this data column. The one thing I'm hoping for, right, is as you know that BigQuery has this new data type called JSON, right? So the JSON type, not a string, but a JSON type, which is very, very powerful. That's currently still in preview, but what I'm really hoping for is, this data column would support a type that of JSON in addition to string and bytes. And then what that means is when you have JSON as semi-structured data at the very, at the message producing time, and it will naturally fit into this, because one problem with the string type is, let's say when you need to look for this data, right? And it doesn't give you the cost saving of, just looking at part of the data, but the JSON type would give you that. And then if you're only looking at, a very small proportion of the JSON document, then it wouldn't charge you for the whole thing, right? That's not just the cost, but it's also the the scan efficiencies on the data access patterns. So I think eventually, if this also support the JSON type, I think this feature will be a lot more useful for semi-structured data than what it is right now. So I think hopefully that's useful to you guys, and yes, that's the end of the session. I'll see you next time.
Go out!